Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to this CSG Academy webinar on the American Society of Civil Engineers 2017 Infrastructure Report Card. My name is Sean Sloan. I'm the Director of Transportation and Infrastructure Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. I'm actually in New York City this afternoon, but my colleague Lisa McKinney is back at CSG HQ holding down the fort. Our guests are calling in today from Washington, D.C. and from the great state of Oregon. So we are spread out across the country to bring you this webinar today, and that is just as it should be given the nature of our topic this afternoon. You know, every 4 years, ASCE issues grades across 16 infrastructure categories. The report card is a resource that I think policymakers always look to with great interest, not only for what it can tell them about where their states stand, but also where they need to direct their resources and policies in the future. It is both a snapshot of the status quo and a call to action, and we know anecdotally that many state officials have used the report card to make the case for additional investment in their states. ASCE has been a great friend to CSG over the years. We've regularly featured them at our Transportation Policy Academy events and at CSG national conferences. So we are pleased to be joined today by a couple of folks from ASCE who are going to take us through the grades in the report card, the methodology they use to come up with those grades, the investment gaps, the solutions, and the plethora of ASCE resources that are available to state policymakers. But we'd also like to hear from you today. If at any point during the webinar you have a question or comment for our presenters, you may type it into the GoToWebinar taskbar on your computer screen, and we will ask as many as time allows at the end of the webinar. Right now, I want to bring in our presenters. Brian Palish is Managing Director for Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at ASCE. Since 2008, he has managed ASCE's strategic initiatives, including development of the report card. Brian is joining us today from the CSG DC office. And later on, actually, first off, we're going to hear from Greg DiLoretto, who is the chair of the ASCE 2017 Infrastructure Report Card. He's the past president of ASCE and the former CEO of the Tualatin Valley Water District in Portland, Oregon. He's joining us today from Portland. And thanks to both of you for joining us. Greg, I will hand things off to you to get us started.
Okay, well, thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about infrastructure, an issue that increasingly dominates the news across the country and has serious consequences for our nation's economy, not to mention our quality of life. As Sean mentioned, I am Greg DiLoretto. I'm the chair of the American Society of Civil Engineers Committee on America's Infrastructure, responsible for the report card, and a past president of ASCE. And I'm joined by my colleague, Brian Palish, who's ASCE's Managing Director of Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives. So this afternoon, we'll be sharing the results of ASCE's 2017 Infrastructure Report Card, solutions to raise the grades, and then resources for your use. As the nation's oldest engineering society, representing 150,000 civil engineers who serve as stewards of infrastructure here in the U.S. and around the globe, ASCE serves as a leading advocate for sustainable infrastructure. As Sean mentioned, part of this advocacy is that every 4 years since 1998, we have prepared a comprehensive assessment of the nation's 16 major infrastructure categories in our infrastructure report card. And we use a simple, familiar A to F school report card format, and the report card examines current infrastructure conditions and needs, assigns grades, and then makes recommendations to raise them. Next slide. Americans' awareness of infrastructure and its importance to our quality of life and economy is rising, along with a greater understanding about the increasingly concerning state of our nation's aging infrastructure. In fact, public opinion polling shows that a significant number of Americans, 87% in one recent poll, agree the federal government should increase its investment in infrastructure. So this growing recognition, which transcends political ideology, has led to candidates for elected office increasingly including infrastructure improvements and investment in their platforms. Consider these two quotes from two well-known officials. First, the bridges and highways we failed to repair today will have to be rebuilt tomorrow at many times the cost Rebuilding our infrastructure is common sense, an investment in tomorrow that we must make today. And the second quote, crumbling infrastructure will be replaced with new roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, and railways gleaming across our very, very beautiful land. These two statements, the first from President Reagan in 1982, and the second from President Trump during his February address to Congress, demonstrate that for nearly 3 decades, our elected officials have known that America's infrastructure has needed attention, improvement, and investment. And yet, even when the President of the United States has called for it, many leaders at the federal level have eschewed their adequate investment, shirking their responsibilities and watching out for American families and caring for the very backbone of our economy. Now, while some investment and progress has been made, particularly at the state level, it's not enough to prepare our nation for a 21st century economy relying on 20th century infrastructure and 20th century funding. Meanwhile, other nations have committed to infrastructure investments that will attract the businesses, innovations, and jobs of tomorrow, jeopardizing America's economic leadership in the global economy. In fact, China spends more on economic infrastructure annually than North America and Western Europe combined. Infrastructure spending from 1992 to 2013, annual average as a percentage of gross domestic product, China spent 8.6%, while the United States and Canada spent 2.5% respectively, and Western Europe 2.5%. Meanwhile, Japan is expected to spend 1.5% more of its gross domestic product on infrastructure to meet its economic needs during the next 15 years in order to avoid a substantial growth slowdown. The U.S. is underspending by 0.7%. As you are about to see in the report card's grades, America's infrastructure challenges are significant and cause for concern. Next slide. So first, let's refresh your memories from your school days as to what each grade means. Now, if you got an A in our report card, that's exceptional, fit for the future, in excellent condition. A B is good, adequate for now, but some elements show sign of general deterioration that require attention. If you got a C, that's mediocre, requires attention. Some elements exhibit significant deficiencies with increasing vulnerability. And a D, poor, at risk, with many elements approaching the end of their service life. Condition and capacity are of serious concern with strong risk of failure. And finally, an F, failing, critical, unfit for purpose with signs of imminent failure. Next slide. The report card is prepared by the ASCE Committee on America's Infrastructure, which for this report card includes 28 civil engineers from around the country with expertise across the 16 categories, and I serve as the chair of the committee. With ASCE staff, the committee evaluates relevant data and reports from government agencies, the private sector, nonprofits, and other organizations, and then we meet with technical and industry experts to gain a wider view of the nation's infrastructure. It's important to note that ASCE does not create the data for this report card. The committee then examines each category, industry-wide, not project-specific, in the context of 8 key criteria before determining a grade. And let's go over those criteria. First is condition. What is the infrastructure's existing and near future physical condition? Capacity. Does the infrastructure's capacity meet current and future demands? Funding. What is the current level of funding from all levels of government and sources for the infrastructure category as compared to the estimated need? Future need. What is the cost to improve the infrastructure? Will future funding prospects address the need? Operation and maintenance. What is the owner's ability to operate and maintain the infrastructure properly? Public safety. To what extent is public safety jeopardized by the condition of the infrastructure, and what could be the consequences of failure? Resilience. What is the infrastructure system's capability to prevent or protect against significant multi-hazard threats and incidents? How able is it to quickly recover and reconstitute critical services with minimum consequences for public safety and health, the economy, and national security? And finally, innovation. What new and innovative techniques, materials, technologies, and delivery methods are being implemented to improve the infrastructure? The 16 category level grades are then averaged, just as on your school report card with English and math and science and so forth, to determine an overall grade for the nation. And upon assigning the grades, the committee then makes recommendations as to how to raise the grades for the nation's infrastructure generally and in each of the 16 categories. Needless to say, since ASCE's first infrastructure report card, the grades have not been ones to make Lady Liberty proud. ASCE has yet to give an overall grade out of the D's. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, that remains true in 2017, where our infrastructure report card, America's cumulative GPA, is once again a D+. The cumulative grade of D+ reflects the significant backlog of needs facing our nation's infrastructure, particularly in the three categories that experienced a decline in grade this year: parks, solid waste, and especially transit, the report card's lowest grade at a D-. 6 categories of grades remained unchanged from 2013: aviation, bridges, dams, drinking water, energy, and roads, with all but bridges stalled in the D's. Yet there are signs of progress. 7 categories saw slight improvements: hazardous waste, inland waterways, levees, ports, rail, schools, and wastewater. Where we see areas of infrastructure that improved, those categories benefited from 3 things: strong leadership, thoughtful policymaking, and investments that garnered results. These improvements demonstrate what can be accomplished when innovative solutions that move projects forward are implemented. So let's take a closer look at each of the categories to see what has, or in many cases hasn't, improved in the 4 years since ASCE's last report card. Next slide, please. So the transportation categories represent some of the most recognizable infrastructure in our country, and the first thing that comes to mind for many Americans when they hear the word infrastructure. So for roads, the grade D, it's the same. America's roads are often crowded, frequently in poor condition, chronically underfunded, and are becoming more dangerous. More than 2 out of every 5 miles in America's urban interstates are congested, and traffic delays cost the country $160 billion in wasted time and fuel. Americans on average waste 43 hours a year stuck in traffic. Think about that. That is 1 of your 2 weeks vacation you spent stuck in traffic. Aviation, the grade is D, it's the same. U.S. airports serve more than 2 million passengers every day, and congestion is growing. It's expected that by 2020, 24 of 30 major airports will experience Thanksgiving peak traffic at least once a year. You know how many of us dislike traveling in Thanksgiving Day holidays. The mandated cap on how much airports can charge passengers for facility maintenance has created a $42 billion funding gap between now and 2025. Bridges, the grade is a C+, that's the same, but over 200 million trips are taken every day across the country's nearly 59,000 structurally deficient bridges. That's 9.1% of bridges. Now, structurally deficient doesn't mean they're unsafe, but it does mean they require more repair and more frequent inspection. The overall condition of American bridges, however, has been stagnant, and the backlog totals $123 billion. Transit is our worst grade in 2017, a D-, it's down from 2013. Transit in America is hitting ridership records, 10.75 billion trips, yet the symptoms of overdue maintenance and underinvestment have never been clearer, or in some cases more dangerous, resulting in the report card's lowest grade. Friends of mine in Seattle tell me that transit systems up there move the equivalent of 4 lanes of interstate travel. And if you've been to Seattle, you know we're not widening I-5 4 more lanes through downtown. The nation's transit systems are chronically underfunded. resulting in aging infrastructure and a $90 billion maintenance backlog. Next slide, please. Dams. Dams received the same grade as 2013, a D. The nation's dams are aging, and due to increased development, the number of high hazard potential dams continues to rise, currently reaching over 15,000 dams. It's estimated that it will require an investment of nearly $45 billion to repair aging, yet critical high hazard potential dams. Levees. The grade for levees is up. Levees was one of our worst categories in 2013. Today it has a grade of D. Our nationwide network of 30,000 to 100,000 miles of levees protect millions of Americans. And levees in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Levee Safety Program alone protect over 300 colleges and universities, 30 professional sports venues, and my favorite, 100 breweries, and an estimate $1.3 trillion in property. Drinking water. My area received the same grade as 2013, a grade of D. For the first time in 40 years, Americans are using less water due to increased efficiencies in fixtures and declining industrial uses. Yet, there are still an estimated 240,000 water main breaks per year in the United States, wasting over 2 trillion gallons of treated drinking water every year. The quality of drinking water remains high, but attention to legacy and emerging contaminants must be addressed. For wastewater, the grade increased over 2013 to a D+. Our nation's nearly 15,000 wastewater treatment plants protect public health and the environment. But more than 56 million new users are projected to be part of that centralized treatment systems over the next 2 decades, and an estimated $271 billion is needed to meet current and future demands. Next slide, please. Inland waterways. That was also one of our worst grades in 2013, but it is up to a D this time. 25,000 miles of inland waterways, delivering about 14% of all domestic freight. But most locks and dams on the system are well beyond their 50-year design life, and nearly half of vessels experience delays. Investment in the waterway system has increased in recent years, but upgrades on the system will take decades to complete. Ports grade has improved over 2013 to a C+. The nation's nearly 1,000 ports serve as the gateway through which 99% of overseas trade passes, which is responsible for $4.6 trillion in economic activity, which is over a quarter of the U.S. economy. Ships are getting bigger, though, and congestion at landside connections, as well as limited capacity for larger ships on the water side, increasingly hinders ports' productivity. Rail's our highest grade for 2017. It's a grade of B, good condition, where we believe all of our infrastructure needs to be. But the primary reason for that is that the private freight rail industry has made significant investment in recent years, including investing $27 billion in 2015 alone. Next slide, please. Our solid waste grade, which was the highest in 2013, is down this year to a C+. It comes in tied for second, but as recycling rates have plateaued, the grade has decreased. Overall management of municipal solid waste across America is currently in fair condition and sufficiently funded, but there is a need to change the way we think of how solid waste is generated, managed, and potentially used as a resource. The hazardous waste grade has improved to a D+. Over 18,000 sites are related to the primary hazardous waste programs that comprise much of the nation's hazardous waste infrastructure. But more than half of the U.S. population lives within 3 miles of a hazardous waste site. And recent proposed funding cuts for EPA could lower this grade and would have a serious impact on public health and safety. Energy received the same grade as in 2013, a D+. Most of our electric transmission and distribution lines were constructed in the 1950s and 60s with a 50-year life expectancy, and the more than 640,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines in the lower 48 state power grids are at full capacity. Without greater attention to aging equipment, capacity bottlenecks, and increased demand, as well as increasing storm and climate impacts, Americans will likely experience longer and more frequent power interruptions, with an already estimated 3,600 outages in a single year. Again, a huge impact on our economy and our quality of life. Next slide, please. Parks and Recreation, the grade decreased from 2013 to a D+. There's a vast network of infrastructure that goes into supporting more than 7 billion outdoor recreational outings. Yet the National Park Service alone estimates nearly 12 billion in deferred maintenance. And finally, schools. The grade for schools is a D+ and up from our 2013 report card. Every school day, nearly 50 million K through 12 students and 6 million adults that occupy close to 100,000 public school buildings. But the nation continues to underinvest in school facilities, leaving an estimated $38 billion annual gap. As a result, 1/4 of our public school buildings were rated as being in fair or poor condition. Sean?
Okay, so now you've heard the grades in the report card for this year. Just a reminder here, if you have a question for our presenters, you may type it into the GoToWebinar taskbar, and we will collect those and ask as many as time allows. And now back to Greg.
Okay, next slide, please. So, these grades and these 16 categories should be cause for concern and reflect the fact that America's infrastructure bill is long overdue. In addition to grading the nation's infrastructure every 4 years, ASCE estimates the investment needed in each infrastructure category to maintain a state of good repair and earn that grade of B. Now, our most recent analysis reveals that the U.S. has been paying only about half of its infrastructure bill for some time, and failing to close that gap risks rising costs, falling business productivity, plummeting GDP, lost jobs, and ultimately reduced disposable income for every American family. Between 2016 and 2025, the estimated investment gap to bring our infrastructure to a good condition totals just over $2 trillion or $200 billion per year. And even though Congress and some states have recently made efforts to invest more in infrastructure, unfortunately these efforts do not come anywhere close to what's needed. We've simply failed to invest for too long, and now we're struggling to catch up. Next slide, please. So what happens if we just continue with our D+ grades? Well, failing to close this infrastructure investment gap brings serious economic consequences. According to ASCE's latest economic study, Failure to Act, prepared in 2016, if we do not address the infrastructure investment gap, we will see potentially a $3.9 trillion in U.S. GDP loss by 2025. That's the equivalent today of Germany's GDP. We potentially could see the loss to businesses of close to $7 trillion by 2025, and the loss of 2.5 million high-paying jobs in the year 2025 alone. But here's the big number. On top of that, each American family is already losing $3,400 in disposable income each year, more than $9 a day due to poor infrastructure. That's income we could be saving or spending on other things that make our lives better, but instead we're spending it on car repairs, wasted time and gas, and increased costs for goods. Yet with about $4 a day per family, the price of a nice cup of coffee, we can solve this. So we will spend the $9 a day if we don't spend the $4, and we'll get nothing for it at $9. So what do we do about the poor state of our nation's infrastructure and this widening investment gap? Well, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Brian Palish, who has all the answers, and he'll lay out ASCE's recommended solutions. Brian?
Greg, thank you very much, and thanks everyone on the phone for joining us today. To raise the national infrastructure grade over the next 4 years, ASCE urges the following starting points. Next slide, please. Investment, leadership and planning, and preparation for future needs. Next slide, please. If the United States is serious about achieving an infrastructure system fit for the 21st century, some specific steps must be taken, beginning with increased long-term and consistent investment. Delaying investment only escalates costs and increases the risks of an aging infrastructure system, something that the nation can no longer afford, and Greg clearly demonstrated in the slide prior to this one. Delaying investment only escalates costs and increases the risks. There's a close to $2 trillion in the 10-year investment gap, and we need to close that gap to meet the future need and restore our global competitive advantage. We need to increase investment from all levels of government and the private sector from 2.5% to 3.5% of U.S. gross domestic product by 2025. This investment must be consistently and wisely allocated. To do this, our first steps would include the following. Number one, we need to fix the Federal Highway Trust Fund by raising the federal motor fuels tax. As many of you know, we passed a FAST Act a couple of years ago. It sort of had a little bit of what I would call maybe some Washington gimmicks to get us balanced in the right way to be able to move forward with a very, very, very modest increase in funding for the federal highway, federal transportation system. We need to actually go about and fix that Federal Highway Trust Fund. We also need to authorize and fund programs that improve specific categories of deficient infrastructure. As we look back on the last couple of Congresses, we've actually done some good work in authorizing programs that might address some of our aging infrastructure problems, but some of those programs remain unfunded or certainly underfunded as we look forward to the current budget year and the one coming up. We also need to support infrastructure owners and operators and urge them to charge rates and fees that reflect the true cost of using, maintaining, and improving our infrastructure. Change the slide, please. New slide. Thank you. Smart investment is only going to be possible with leadership, planning, and a clear vision for our nation's infrastructure. That's why leaders from all levels of government, business, labor, and nonprofit organizations must come together and ensure all investments are spent wisely, prioritizing projects with critical benefits to the economy, public safety, and quality of life, while also planning for the costs of building, operating, and maintaining that infrastructure for its entire lifespan. We can do this, but we must do a few things. Number one, ASCE believes that we should require all projects greater than $5 million that receive federal funding use life cycle cost analysis and also develop a plan for funding the project, including its maintenance and operation until the end of its service life. No longer can we just build projects and wonder where the maintenance money will come from or the operations money. We need to create incentives for state and local governments and the private sector to invest in maintenance. And lastly, we need to identify a pipeline of infrastructure projects that are attractive to private sector investment and public-private partnerships. Next slide. Last but not least, we must prepare for the future, utilizing new approaches, materials, and technologies to ensure our infrastructure is resilient and sustainable. This includes considering emerging technologies and shifting social, environmental, and economic trends, autonomous vehicles, distributed power generation and storage, for example, when building new infrastructure to assure its long-term utility. We also need to support research and development to modernize and extend the life of our current infrastructure, expedite overhauling that infrastructure, and also promoting efficiencies. Next slide. The good news is we're already seeing some of these approaches and utilizing some of these solutions in communities across the country. ASCE continues to seek to spotlight some of these efforts through our Game Changers project, which features groundbreaking infrastructure projects from around the country and across all 16 categories of infrastructure that use innovative technologies, materials, and approaches to tackle infrastructure challenges and make real, long-lasting improvements. From rapid bridge replacement to drones for infrastructure inspection, civil engineers, elected officials, and citizens are working together to explore and deploy game-changing solutions to improve the nation's infrastructure. Next slide.
And I know that you're going to wrap things up here with a look at all the great ASCE resources that are available to state policymakers. I did want to break in once again at this point and remind folks that if you have a question or comment for our presenters, you may type it into the GoToWebinar taskbar, and we will ask as many of those questions as time allows at the end of the program here. And now back to Brian and Greg.
Thanks, Sean. Next slide. But there is more to be done. We all need to work together to ensure our infrastructure is built for the future. Opportunity exists right now to make good on ASCE's recommendations to solve our nation's infrastructure crisis, as the Trump administration and U.S. Congress weigh infrastructure legislation and state and local governments around the country look to take action in their communities. ASCE welcomes the opportunity to work with officials at all levels of government to develop a workable plan to repair and modernize our nation's infrastructure and foster economic growth. We are particularly encouraged by the signs from President Trump and the leaders in Congress to work together on this bipartisan issue that will contribute to significant gains for the American economy and families. There's no magic wand to address this crisis, either from an infrastructure money tree or from the private sector so often touted as the key to revitalizing infrastructure. Solving our infrastructure crisis will take collective action and tough choices. Government and the private sector must partner to close our infrastructure deficit, commit to a future in which we improve infrastructure and value it as a key to our quality of life and economic prosperity. We urge all of you to join us in this partnership, beginning with visits to infrastructurereportcard.org and downloading the new app that we have that details this infrastructure report card. If you look up Save America's Infrastructure in the App Store, whichever is your favorite, you will find it there. The report card, first and foremost, lives online. On our website and app, you can read full chapters on all 16 categories, explore interactive maps, visuals, and graphics across all types of infrastructure. We've also compiled some videos on the report card and various categories. You can also see what the conversation about infrastructure looks like on social media and take a look at game changers and read more from our Failure to Act economic study. As part of ASCE's advocacy efforts, we've also made it easy for website visitors and app users to contact their elected officials, sorry about that, at all levels of government through emails and tweets. This issue is too important to be left on the shelf any longer. Next slide, please. Recognizing how powerful and impactful it can be when we localize the infrastructure challenges our country faces, we also have a whole host of state-related resources available on the website. Through our infrastructure super map, as we like to call it, and pages for each state and the District of Columbia, we break down 50 state data across report card categories, allowing visitors to see how the states compare in infrastructure according to the number and percentage of structurally deficient bridges, the amount of high hazard potential dams, and the 20-year drinking water needs. Next slide. In more than half the states, we also have state infrastructure report cards prepared by ASCE's local sections and branches following the model and methodology of the national report card. State report cards are prepared by committees of volunteer civil engineers from ASCE's local groups across the country on a rolling basis. Just as in the national report card, state report cards grade the categories of infrastructure present in the state, as well as give an overall grade and provide recommendations for ways to improve that infrastructure. The website currently features all of the state report cards ASCE local groups have prepared since 2013, and there are more on the way. In fact, New Hampshire releases its state report card tomorrow. Louisiana and Texas are coming soon, and we have more that we are just starting to get underway. We hope you will find these resources to be valuable as you look to put the national report card in context with the infrastructure in your state. Please do not hesitate to contact us with your questions about a state report card in your state or additional help that we might be able to offer as you consider infrastructure issues and legislation at the state level. Next slide. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share the report card with you today and for your interest in this critical topic that underpins our quality of life, public safety, public health, and the success of the American economy. All Americans share a role in renewing the nation's infrastructure, beginning with learning about and appreciating the infrastructure all around them, sharing this report card and advocating for long-term investment, visionary leadership, thoughtful planning, and thorough preparation for the future. We cannot afford not to. We look forward to working with you to help to continue to make infrastructure a priority across the nation and at the federal level. We'd be happy to take any questions, or you can contact us at reportcard@asce.org. I'd also just like to take 1 second to say thank you to CSG. We've had a long-standing partnership with the organization, and we feel it's been beneficial for both of us. We enjoy the time we spend with not only the CSG staff, but also the members of CSG in talking about infrastructure and learning about the things you guys are doing back home.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks, Greg, for that great presentation. We want to turn now to questions. Again, if you have a question or comment for our presenters today, you may type it into the GoToWebinar taskbar, and we will ask as many as time allows. Gentlemen, while we wait for those questions to come in, I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask a couple here off the top. First of all, I'm sure this is a question that you all get asked rather frequently, and it's one that always seems to come up in the articles about the report card. It's one that I asked the last time we did this webinar back in 2013, and it goes something like this. How do you respond to folks who would say, well, of course, the American Society of Civil Engineers is saying there needs to be trillions of dollars in additional infrastructure spending because they have a vested interest. Their members stand to benefit from that investment. Why should folks see ASCE as an objective source and an honest broker in putting this information out there?
This is Greg, and I'll give you the answer that I give whenever I do get that question, although I get it considerably less than, say, in years past. I always like to use an analogy that when you go to the doctor and you have a checkup and the doctor says, gee, Sean, I think there's something wrong here. I'm going to send you to a specialist. In fact, it's something I believe in your heart. I'm going to send you to a heart doctor, and I want you to get checked out. And you go there, and the doctor says, oh my gosh, Sean, you've got 3 arteries plugged. We're going to have to do a bypass. Now, is the doctor sending you there to the specialist so that they can make more money unclogging your arteries, or are they trying to save your life? The fact of the matter is that we are the doctors of America's infrastructure, and your arteries are clogged, your freeways are clogged, your pipelines are broken, and we have a responsibility to tell the American public what's going on with their infrastructure. We're the ones that design it, we build it, we operate it, we maintain it. We have a responsibility to let people know, guess what, folks, this thing's falling apart, and we need to fix it. It's getting more expensive every day that we wait to do something about it.
Great. I think a number of state officials and others have been intrigued that President Trump has been talking about perhaps a $1 trillion infrastructure investment. But do you all have concerns that what he may be talking about in terms of how to finance such a plan wouldn't necessarily be applicable or beneficial to some categories of infrastructure, some states, or even some projects?
This is Greg again. We do have concerns, and one thing we have to remember is that financing is not funding. And what we're short of in this country is funding. For most of us, certainly in the public sector, we have access to the municipal bond market. We can borrow money to finance our projects. It's the funding that we have problems with. So while you can finance it, we also need to understand how we're going to fund that infrastructure as it goes along. Now, unfortunately, and I'm saying this, is in the skinny budget that was released, there was a decrease in 2 of the water and wastewater funding areas that we need to fund if we're going to meet state drinking water or safe drinking water standards and clean water standards. So the fact is, and those are just financing mechanisms again, they're not funding mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. And aren't there vastly more sort of state of good repair projects and maintenance projects that are desperately needed than there are sort of big ticket shovel ready greenfield toll road projects, for example, or whatever? And you know, some of Trump's comments have suggested he's a supporter of sort of a fix-it-first kind of approach, but is that really possible given his preferred financing method again?
Again, this is Greg. If you look at our report card, of course, it covers those categories of how we measure the report card, and certainly one of the key ones is operations and maintenance, and you heard Brian mention that as well. All too often, the brand new projects are, certainly the most fun. They're the ones that get the attention. But you're absolutely right. We have an existing infrastructure worth trillions of dollars. It's like having an existing house and saying, well, you know what? I'm just going to forget this house and just let it go, and I'm going to go build a brand new house because that's a lot more fun and it'll be brand new. That doesn't make economic sense. We have to maintain the house we're in. It's one of our most valuable assets, whether it means a roof or a paint job or whatever. We have to do that. Well, the same is with our infrastructure. We have miles of water pipelines. We have miles of existing roads, miles of bridges, dams, all that. You can't just let that go and build new stuff. That's what needs our attention. And of course, that's what's measured in the data that we get from public agencies and private sources.
Yeah. In recent years, it strikes me that we've seen events like the Flint water crisis and the challenges at the Oroville Dam draw attention to some infrastructure categories that don't often get a lot of press and perhaps open up a broader assessment of what's going on with those kinds of infrastructure around the country. As you look across the categories graded in the report card, are there categories of infrastructure that maybe haven't had their sort of canary in a coal mine moment yet, but that policymakers nevertheless should be very concerned about so they can at least try to be somewhat proactive about preventing such a crisis in the future?
Well, actually, they all are in that situation, with the exception of rail. Again, in the report, rail had the grade of B. They spent a lot of money on rail, not only the $27 billion in 2015, but they spent $20 billion a year from 2009 to 13. So they've made their investments. But every single other category there is not at a grade of B. They're in the Ds. They're all in that situation. Frankly, we shouldn't have to wait for a Flint, Michigan, or a collapsed bridge or a dam problem to have a response and improve our infrastructure. But I will tell you, the longer we continue to defer making the adequate investment, the more Flint, Michigans we're going to see, the more dams we're going to see, the more bridge problems we're going to see, the more stuck in traffic we're going to see. In fact, by some estimates, if you live in Los Angeles, a recent article said those people waste 104 hours a year stuck in traffic. That is their entire 2-week vacation. You just tell your boss, hey, I'm going to take 2 weeks on the 405. I'm on vacation. So.
Well, and I think it's also interesting, Sean, and I think it does run across all categories. There are projects that can be projects and problems that can be addressed across all categories. I think you hear a lot of in the discussions that we have on the high-level facts. There's a lot of discussion about this type of asset or that type of asset on average is more than 50 years old. And what that's telling us basically is that we've got a lot of old infrastructure, and in some regards, one of the folks that we interviewed as we were doing the video segments, he put it best, I think, where his comment was, we took a generational vacation from investing in our nation's infrastructure. And that basically we've taken that time off from investing in infrastructure, and that really is showing. We have, we built the interstate highway system, which is a tremendous system, and then we thought we were just done and didn't need to necessarily improve and maintain it. And that's not entirely true across the country, but writ large, we do have problems that do run across the entire country, whether it's aging bridges, whether it's pavement conditions, whether it's that congestion in Los Angeles that those of you that visit there get to experience. We have somewhat the same level of congestion in Washington D.C. So it is one of those things. If you get to experience it, it does give you a different perspective on some of that.
I wanted to ask about transit, and it's clear that President Trump and some, though not all, Republicans may want to significantly cut federal support for public transit. Last November, as Trump was elected, we also saw a number of communities around the country approve ballot measures to provide additional local funding for transit. but many of the proposed transit projects in those communities would require support from the federal government. At the same time, we're seeing aging transit systems like the DC Metro and the T in Boston experience struggles as a result of long deferred maintenance. If Trump's policies come to pass, can transit survive and flourish without a strong federal partner?
Well, I mean, I think that is one of those difficult questions that's out there, Sean. I mean, I think we support and will continue to argue that there needs to be a federal role in supporting the nation's transit systems. Look, in your larger metropolitan areas and, frankly, in rural communities, if the federal government was not a partner in transit, problems with congestion or even problems with some basic services, if you look at the rural transit piece of this, would have difficulty in functioning. We closed Metro. You noted the problems at the Washington, D.C. Metro. We happened to have our fly-in about a year ago. It was last March, so March of 2016, and they decided on the day we were sending 200 engineers to Capitol Hill, they decided they were going to close the Metro for the day due to safety concerns. We couldn't probably have written a better script for our members, because as engineers they could explain the importance of putting safety first, while also talking about the importance of infrastructure investment as the problem not having been addressed as to why we got there. The reality is transit is an important part of our surface transportation solution for the nation. Whether you're a trucking company and want to move around this country, transit helps you do that by getting some folks off the road. If you're in a rural area, it helps folks who do not have access to their own private vehicle to get to places as well. It connects people, and it connects people to jobs, and connects people to economic opportunity. So I think it's one of those ones that is going to be a discussion that will be much had in Washington, D.C. in the coming months.
The other thing that we've heard about Trump's infrastructure plan is that he wants to speed up permitting and get projects underway faster. There's been talk about a 90-day window for using federal funds on a project and using arbitration to resolve issues on a project quickly. Back during the Recovery Act, we were talking about an 18-month window to get projects started, and President Obama later famously was forced to concede that there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project. I know that MAP 21 sought to speed up permitting and the NEPA process and everything. How successful have those efforts to speed up projects been, and can anything that's being talked about now get them started and on their way to completion faster, or do some projects simply need time?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and Greg, you'll chime in after me, I hope, but I think from our perspective is you have had a number of pieces of legislation that have passed during the last two Congresses that have not fully taken effect yet. You mentioned MAP 21. There were also provisions in the FAST Act, which was the last surface transportation bill that passed after MAP 21. You have both water resources bills. There was WRDA 14 and the WIN Act, which was the bill in 2016. All of those pieces of legislation had provisions in them to speed the federal process for project approval. We've supported all of those provisions. We think that's an important piece of the puzzle. I think there is more than just federal problems in getting project approval. So you know, I think we need to look at all various sort of the hiccups to project approval. But that is not the sole culprit in why we don't get infrastructure developed in this country. I would also look to the fact that we don't have the right amount of funding for these projects, and so some of the projects sit around waiting for funding, which is not as abundant as we'd like it to be, and you know, we've already discussed that subject.
And you know, to follow up what Brian's talking about, I know for those of you, the folks that are listening here, of course, we've all experienced this process you go through to get an infrastructure project approved. It goes from one agency for review to the next agency for review to the next, to the next, to the next. Each one comments, and then you go through that do loop for continuously. I am familiar with a project in my old agency before I retired where we were able to use a program where all the agencies came together at once, and it was allowed, and we were able to go through that review process one time instead of this continuous do loop that many of us have had to go through. But the fact is, the regulations are slowing us down. If we look in the energy sector, they'll tell you, you know, we're pretty close on the amount of money we need for projects. Our problem is, for transmission projects, our problem is the time it takes for us to get a permit to do them.
You know, we hear a number of folks on both sides of the aisle say the one thing they don't want the Trump infrastructure initiative to become is Recovery Act 2, because they feel like some of that money was wasted on road restriping and bridge painting and the like. Should Trump's plan have different goals in mind from the Recovery Act, and is there reason to believe that it can be structured differently to achieve those goals?
Yeah, I don't, you know, I would question that the money was wasted. I mean, the money that went out for projects, it did projects. Now, maybe it didn't do the projects that people thought would be done, but it did projects. And yes, a number of them were paving projects, which needed to be done, by the way. That's probably one of the biggest areas, certainly in transportation, where we need to invest money, is in repaving and rebuilding our roadways. So it did a lot of those simply because they were easy to do, they're quick to do. It did a number of water projects that were not only ready to go, but were smaller. I think the biggest issue was that out of the Recovery Act, the amount of money that went for infrastructure, and Brian can tell you the amount, wasn't what we thought was going to go to infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I would scratch my head if someone's complaining about bridge painting. If you've got a steel bridge, if you don't paint it, it will rust and it will fall into the river. So that we would call that regular operations and maintenance, and that's probably a good use of funds. And you, by doing that, you probably don't need to replace the bridge. So not to pick on your point, Sean. I know you're just repeating what others have said. I would say that the money was a lot less. I feel as though, if we're being generous, it was an $800+ billion piece of legislation. If we're generous, that number was probably around $80 to $100 billion for infrastructure investment. That is through a variety of means, right? That's the increasing the water SRF program, that's in Corps of Engineers funding, that's DOT funding, et cetera. My only other number that sticks in my head is there were $300 billion worth of tax cuts that were also in that $800 billion bill. So, I know from our perspective, we would have flip-flopped those numbers, and we would have put $300 billion towards infrastructure, and we would have taken some things, a few more projects off the table. Although, again, there probably weren't that many shovel-ready projects, but there were projects that need to be built that we could have built without some of the arbitrary time limits and the quote-unquote necessity for it to be shovel-ready.
A question here about sort of workforce issues. If you look at the period between 2009 and 2012, we had a lingering recession. We had the Recovery Act, but we did not have a long-term transportation bill during those years. And as a result, a number of states probably held back on green-lighting a bunch of projects because of the uncertainty that federal funding would be there long-term. What kind of impact did that period have on the construction and engineering trades, and does that impact on the workforce continue now as we contemplate a potentially large program to build and repair infrastructure in this country?
Yeah, we don't have numbers as to what would actually happen necessarily, but you're right that a number of DOTs didn't pursue projects because they didn't have the certainty that they were going to have funding for them in the future. So that certainly slowed things down. I mean, we're certainly seeing today, though, engineering firms are quite busy. There are projects are going on now, and we're seeing enrollments in engineering universities increasing, but we still have a shortage of people in the engineering field, and we have the same issue potentially with the construction industry as well. People left the industry during the recession. Many didn't return.
In addition to the report card, there are a number of other resources from other organizations out there that come out periodically, and states are also getting better about generating their own performance data and putting that out. We just put out a capital research brief on the state of performance measurement and management, which sort of began in earnest under MAP 21 and continues now under the FAST Act. How do you see performance measurement evolving in the years ahead and being able to support the case that ASCE is making in the report card?
Well, I think from our perspective, those performance measures need to be in place now. They're certainly a little bit tardy. I also think that if we're going to use federal funds wisely and put them to the right problems, that having performance measures and understanding where we're at with a given type of infrastructure asset, that having those performance measures is going to help us do that.
Well, great. Well, Brian and Greg, we are out of time for today's webinar. I want to thank Brian Palish and Greg DiLoretto from the American Society of Civil Engineers for joining us this afternoon. Thanks also to everyone who logged on to join us today. Be sure to check the CSG website for information about future eCademy webinars on transportation and infrastructure and other topics. I'm Sean Sloan in New York. Thanks to my colleague Lisa McKinney at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Thanks to our friends at the CSG DC office as well for hosting one of our guests today. And thanks again for joining us.